I met a guy online. We really got on and he came over a few times so we could hang out. I did find him attractive and tried to hint that I was into him. Note: I can't flirt to save my life, but nothing ever happened. After a few dates, he suddenly vanished offline. No social media. He wasn't answering texts or emails. Nothing. I thought he'd ghosted me. After 6 months he reappears. I asked him where he'd been and he said, "I don't want to talk about it." A few weeks after, there was a fad where people were googling their names and posting humorous stories they had found about similar people with their name. Mine was about a ship that had my initials, and I started to google friends' names just out of boredom, morbid curiosity. Googled his name and found a local news story from his area. One of those crime and courts things that he had been done for statutory pay of a minor. Online grooming and had his computer and phone seized as evidence. Guy I knew in college met a girl online and spent every day talking about her. She lived about 6 hours away. So he planned to take a semester off and pursue this relationship. He got a job in her town and asked if I'd have him move out there since my car would hold more than he could take on a bus. I had a long weekend off and figured, why not? A road trip could be fun. I'd drive him out as a goodbye present. And the way back I planned to visit Yellowstone. Well, we arrive and it turns out he doesn't have an apartment lined up and he found a job posting in his girlfriend's town. He hadn't actually gotten the job or even applied yet. I make a bunch of phone calls and find him a room to rent that will let him move in that day with just first, last, and deposit. Even without a job. I'm tired and disgusted with his lack of planning. But figure it's worth staying the night and trying to end things on good terms with my buddy. Then he breaks down and confesses that he hasn't actually met this girl. The nights he spent video chatting with her were really just him watching her vlog and jacking it. They've never talked, never texted, never even emailed. Hell, he's never even left so much as a comment or like on one of her videos. She genuinely didn't, still doesn't, know he existed. His plan was to hang out at this game shop she talks a lot about until she showed up and somehow create a relationship from that. He thought that they'd meet and she'd fall in love with him and move back to our college town to marry him. All before the next semester began. That didn't happen. Instead, I made my buddy buy a bus ticket for his ride back to school and left. He came back to school and got more cringy. Not less. I lost track of him after that. This is way back in the mid-90s. Bulletin board systems were all the rage. I made friends with this guy from NC. He was friends with a bunch of us from my dorm. Mostly females. Which should probably have been a red flag, but I was extremely naive at the time. A couple months in, he mentioned he was coming to our state for a wedding and asked if he could come by our college to meet everyone. It was agreed he'd sleep in my dorm room since my roommate was almost never around. Now, there was no discussion or thought of sex. But I was pretty excited to meet this guy and see if he was as funny and charming as he was online. Well, day arrives. Dude shows up. I should mention that I and all my college friends were 18 or 19. This guy was 24. Or so he said. Guy looked like, and I'm not exaggerating, a cancer patient. Pale. Gaunt features. Long greasy pale blonde hair except where he was bald on top. And just generally looked like he was about to die or he was dressed as a ghoul for Halloween. He insisted on hugging all of us. I was trying to remind myself that looks don't matter and that he was a cool guy despite his very unsettling appearance. But then, when we all started hanging out, things just got worse. He was asking really invasive questions of all of us. Making weird comments to whatever was said. Just all around creepy and distressing. I was sitting on the floor with another friend and actively rocking back and forth from discomfort. I lied and said I had hurt my back and that sleeping on the floor helped. Because that night he kept insisting we could share my tiny twin college bed. Nope. Last time I ever met anyone from that site. I don't know if it's a horror story, but it's how I ended up where I live now. I played WoW for years with a pretty regular group. Got to know them offline, and at one point two of them, a couple, invited me to move across the country. At the time I didn't have anything tying me to where I was. So I packed up and moved. Got out here. Moved in with my friends and everything seemed okay. My buddy was a long haul driver, so he was always gone for days at a time. His girl would try to set me up multiple times with two of her friends at the same time, one in Minnesota. I ended up having a hard time finding work for a while. Finally got a job though and was putting some money away while helping watch their kids. Out of nowhere one day my buddy accuses me of trying to fool around with his girl. Nothing had ever happened, but I had noticed her spending more and more time in my room when he wasn't there. I knew his history, and his previous relationship had ended after she cheated with a friend of his. He wouldn't listen. So I got kicked out without any warning, and they stole about $1K worth of my stuff and later moved. Ultimately it all worked out for me. Cut the friend and his girl out of my life completely and moved on. Now I have a good job here. Wife and kids. Edit clarified that I cut out the friend and the girl, lol, not my wife and kids. We were friends online for years. We'd meet up every so often, and when we started families we'd meet up and take the kids to the zoos or whatever. She wanted us to go on a cruise together with our husbands and kids. I made the comments towards the effect of, "We can't afford that." And she went nuts. "We shouldn't have had kids if we can't afford them. We shouldn't have more children. Our life sucks blah blah blah," because I didn't want to go on a goddamn cruise with her and her bratty ass kid. Sounds like a nightmare. A guy in a forum for a specific hobby would talk to me a lot, but never revealed his real identity. Until out of the blue he suddenly asked me to please come to see him in hospital, where he died a few weeks later. I used to play WoW with my now ex. Our guild leader actually wound up moving to our state with his wife. My ex and I broke up before we got the chance to hang out with the guy. And right after the breakup he messaged my ex essentially asking if it was cool if he and his wife got me drunk and took advantage of me. Ex showed me screenshots when I was getting my stuff from his place, and I cancelled my plans to meet the guy and his wife. My ex had been physically abusive and broke up with me to date the girl he'd cheated on me with. I tried leaving before, but he'd fake suicide attempts and I was so scared he'd go through with it, so I stayed. Even though he was in a new relationship he tried to keep tabs on me and control me. But I saw it as my chance to escape. I happened to move right after we split and he didn't know my new address. I blocked him on everything. Somehow he kept getting information on me though. Turns out the guild leader was feeding him everything. I hadn't deleted the guy off Facebook cause I figured he was only a problem in person. When I confronted him over Messenger, bringing up the abuse, and the guy said, he said he choked you because you guys were arguing and he was afraid he wouldn't get the chance to speak. He still loves you. Side note, the choking was cause I was defending myself against accusations of cheating, which I hadn't done. He was driving cross country with a friend. I said I had a couch floor they could crash on if needed. He was great. She was an annoying BTCH. She hated everything. Was annoyed by my cat. Didn't like anything I had to eat or drink, etc. They were literally there for like 16 hours. I met a really cool group of people from a chat group website called that lives in minimal distance away from me, like maybe 15 minutes, and the horror story part is that I was in my emo phase and probably made a great lasting impact on their lives as a hot topic connoisseur. After 4+ years of playing WoW together and chatting, online and on the phone, he invited me to visit him in Australia. I figured it was safe, since I'd known him for quite a while and had never gotten any weird vibes, no flirtation, no creepiness, nothing. 2 days into my very clearly stated platonic visit, he tried to pay me. I ditched all of my stuff except what I had in a small duffel bag and took off, traveling on my own for the 2 weeks until my flight home. A few months later, I received an unsigned postcard from the Gold Coast that just said, Thinking of you. With a smiley face. This is more of an embarrassment story. When I was in high school in the 90s, I was active on the local dial-up BBS scene. I was friends with someone who went by the handle Venus. I knew she was a woman but had no idea what she looked like. I also knew she was dating a guy in real life with the handle Lord Gumby, who was also a friend online. Being a socially misadjusted 15-year-old, I had a crush on her anyway, even though I knew they were both like 18. This was like 1992, so privacy wasn't as big a concern and they knew my address. This was also when people would randomly come by your house to see if you were home. That's unfathomable today. So one Saturday morning, I'm at home on my computer, totally disheveled and showered and just gross in ratty sweatpants and no shirt. I hear a knock on the front door and go open it. There's a woman who was incredibly beautiful standing there, and she just goes, "Hi, I'm Venus." I stood there for a minute. It seemed like jaw dropped, trying to say something, when Lord Gumby walked up and was like, "Hey doofus. Ever met a woman before?" Needless to say, I wanted to sink into a hole in the ground and die. But I hung out with them, and I guess I wasn't too horrible because we hung out a lot after that. But that whole time I was like, frick my life choices. Haven't talked to them in decades. I wonder how they are doing. It's not a horror story. It's a story about how I was put off meeting people from the internet. I was friends with a bunch of people I met through an online game. After about 2 years, I decided to meet two of them. The two I was meeting were a long distance couple. One from one country and the other from mine. They had met many times and had spent 2 weeks together prior to meeting with me. We met in the city, said hi and hugged and did some touristy stuff. Took their pictures etc, etc. But throughout the whole time, they weren't really talking to me. At first, I put it down to anxiety as I was nervous too. But even after lunch, they were only talking to each other and I felt left out. I even took a sneaky video of them talking to each other and sent it a friend, who agreed it was odd. When it was time for me to leave, I told them I had to go but I had a nice time. And they continued to chat to each other. I said it again but no response. So I started to walk away. Until one of them said, "Oh bye." I was really hurt. It was like they didn't want me to be with them. I had spent a lot of money getting down. Especially since at the time I didn't have a job. When I got back, I stopped talking to them. The friend who I sent the video to sent a message to them asking why they were ignoring me. And they tried to turn it on me, saying that I was the quiet one and that I was being rude to them. Especially leaving without saying goodbye. I blocked them all on the game. Few months go by and one of them finds my social media and tries to reconnect. Starts off well, and then goes back to blaming me. Haven't met anyone from the internet since. I used to play a war game and I was friends with this other person. Was a guy, and we became good friends and talked and all. Then out of the blue he asked me to be his girlfriend. He was a truck driver in the USA and I was only 12. It freaked me out a lot and I ghosted him. It was a terrifying experience and a real eye-opener for me. I was on Meet Me. Met this guy who was super cool. We ended up texting every single day and I took the train out to Los Angeles to meet him. When I got there, he was being kinda shitty and he told me that he hadn't gotten much sleep because he was partying until 5 AM. We walked to his house and when I walked into his room, I was kind of shocked. It was a 8x6, 5 room. All he had was a mat on the floor and a small little jewelry box full of mementos on top of his suitcase of clothes. We took a nap together. Later, we went to get ramen and he asked me to pay. I didn't mind. We went back to his place and we listened to music while we waited to go to a party. Fast forward to that night. We met up with some of his friends and they were so mean to him. They kept roasting him and picking on him and he was visibly getting upset. I stopped him for a bit so his friends could walk ahead of us. I reminded him that it was all fun and games and to ignore them. Ended up at the party and lots of people knew him. I sat out in the patio with a few cool people that I had just met while I waited for my friend to come back from saying hello to everyone inside. He never did. I was outside in the patio with these strangers for about 3 hours. People kept coming up to me and asking if I was alright. I didn't care if I looked sad or if I just looked like a plain loner. I went to find him and it was so packed. Didn't see him, so I walked back. I seen his roommate and asked him to please tell my friend that I was gonna go get a motel. He went to tell him. Came back and said my friend was being a DCK and he would walk me back to the house instead so I didn't have to spend money on a hotel. We got to the house and I thanked him for walking all the way back home. I really appreciated it as my friend was probs inside doing coke or freaking girls. I went to bed in my friend's room and he woke me up in the middle of the night kissing me. Trying to get his freak on. I simply said no. I'm not interested in having sex. His exact words were, "Are you serious? What was the point of you coming here? You're such a waste of time." My feelings were really hurt. I went back to sleep. Woke up and left. Never wrote him after that. He had texted me a month later asking to borrow $50. I simply ignored the message and moved on. I mean, it was okay for a while, but I ended up having to leave his house and take a bus in the middle of the night to a hotel because he was upset that I wouldn't kiss him or sleep with him and that I called him toxic for trying to get me to. Have been through the same thing. Honestly, the guy was much older than me and I should have known better. I was like 16. Couldn't see him as anything other than pathetic after he wouldn't take no for an answer and pouted about it. Then a couple of years later he was busted for CP. Back during WoW's second expansion, there was this guy in my guild I'd become friends with mostly through other friends. We talked more and more over time and became fairly close. He had this arsehole roommate. And I could hear the guy sometimes. Especially when something went wrong during a raid. He'd scream and throw fits. He was pretty awful sounding. My friend told me he wasn't just loud and obnoxious, but verbally and sometimes physically abusive. 2. I had my own apartment. So I said, you know what? Come stay with me. Just long enough to get you on your feet and into a place that's safe. He showed up at my place with a trash bag full of his stuff and a laptop. I set him up in the apartment and started trying to help him find a job. Well, he did not want a job. He did not get a job either. He sat in my apartment day after day, eating my food and slowly draining my savings. No matter how hard I tried to get him motivated, he would just dig in his heels and somehow become more sedentary. Eventually I told him he had to go. I couldn't afford to keep him there. He was just couch surfing. I spoke to some people and eventually pieced together that his method of securing a new temporary place was playing on the sympathies of his friends to convince them he was in a terrible living situation. It just worked really well on me because he had that loud, obnoxious roommate to play off of. He wound up calling a nearby relative to come and get him. I think his aunt. I don't know what he told her I supposedly did. But I have never seen a more venomous look from someone in my life. As far as I know, he moved in with his sister and brother-in-law after that. But frankly, I don't care where he ended up. He also stole a bunch of my stuff. First and last time I do anything like that. I had a layover in Amsterdam and I met up with a buddy I'd been chatting with on Soulseek for years, electronic music file sharing. He gave me directions to his work. We delivered a huge wheel of cheese to a church in the red light district, then got drunk and high in a bar. 10/10 most Dutch experience possible in Amsterdam. Only horror show part was how tall Dutch people are and how they speak English. The guy was like 6'7". And his voice was high to match. And all loopy and sing-songy. Very hard to take seriously as a person. Met this dude on EverQuest and we've played games together ever since. Been a part of the same guild. Help each other out on mobile games. And have conversations about life in general. It isn't him that's the horror story. It was his mom. So one day, I think we were playing WoW at the time. I log on to do some quests. Suddenly his user comes on and asks to chat by video. We've done this before and there's no problem, but after I click to start the video chat, there's his mom butt naked on the screen. She asks me to watch her masturbate and I'm like, no lady, this is just awkward AF. And I log off for a few days. I get an email from my friend and he wants to know why I haven't shown up for quests or anything. So I tell him what happened and he is seriously like, WTF. Turns out his mom had been doing this to a lot of his online buddies and she eventually goes to prison for raping a minor or two. Buddy's doing great though. Wife and kids, plus we still play the occasional game together. Not a horror story, but about a year after I made the move from Massachusetts to South Carolina, I was playing video games and a guy on my team talked about how he just moved into a house in the same area that I moved from. So I PM'd him and turns out that he moved into my old place and was playing in my old room with his desk in the same spot I had mine. Back in about 1998, I met someone playing an online word game. We were both 16-year-old girls and we just hit it off and became very close. Finally in 2004 she was passing though where I live, so I invited her to stay for a few days. She shows up totally coked up. Then she invites some guy over and they were snorting cocaine off her car key in my living room. I didn't know she used coke and I was so uncomfortable the entire time. It was like having a stranger there. Yet we knew everything about each other. We remained in touch and I still really like her, but it was just such an awkward visit. We haven't seen each other since. Though. Edit. Fixed a typo. I went down to Stockholm to meet him. He was so tall. I felt myself nearly shrinking in intimidation and social anxiety. We're married and have been together since early 08. I was the horror in this story. I was part of an online writing community that I really enjoyed and I made a lot of good friends through the years. One man and his wife were visiting from another country, so another guy from my area and I were going to take them to dinner and have a nice in-person evening with sightseeing and conversation. Things kind of blew up for me at that time. My now ex-husband and I were having major issues and I was near my mental and emotional breaking point. I had lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks just from pure stress. On top of that, my family had chosen that evening to have a get together for my uncle who would soon be traveling to undergo surgery for cancer. I showed up in body. But that was basically it. My mind was a million miles away. I wasn't talkative at all. And I left after about an hour. I feel like I lost 3 good friends that evening because of my behavior at dinner and my subsequent withdrawal from the whole community. I'm sure they look back on that evening and think what a nightmare host I was. Edited to add several missing T's. I never actually met him, but I used to play RuneScape when I was younger, around 11ish. I didn't pay for the member account, so there were a bunch of items and things I couldn't get. Some members started gifting me things and I was super grateful. Every time I went on he would help me with my quests and whatever. But over time he started asking more personal questions like what I looked like, what I liked to do, etc. etc. In return he told me his first name, that he was 14 and that he was in the army as some cadet program or something, but back visiting family blah blah. I knew nothing about the army. A cadet program at that age didn't sound that far-fetched to little ol' me. He started to escalate how he was talking to me and started sending me messages like OSSI, miss you, come back and talk to me babe, etc. I stopped replying because I was creeped out and was 11. I still thought boys were gross. Anyway, in school the next day I was making small talk with a girl I sat next to and she mentioned how her brother was home and how much she'd missed him while he'd been away in the army. I got a sinking feeling then, which continued when she told me his name, a match. In desperation I asked her if he ever played RuneScape, in which she said he did and his username was Osifrin's username. She showed me a picture and told me about how she was really excited about how he'd finally found his calling in the army. Dude was 26. Yikes. I met a guy through Match.com. https Match.com. After countless exchanges, we went on a date. He showed up handsome. well dressed and successful. We went to a beautiful French restaurant. During dinner he claimed to feel bad and asked if we could not talk, then proceeded to ask for the check right after the entrees arrived. I asked for the waiter to box my meal. When we got into his car he said, "Let's go to my house. Have coffee and listen to music." I said, "No thank you and please take me home." He drove in the opposite direction. After a 5-minute argument, we went to Starbucks for coffee and he yelled at me because he couldn't smoke in the cafe. Just then a friend texted and invited me to her party a few miles away. I figured this was my out. I asked him to go with me. We were there for about an hour and he said he was ready to leave. I told him I was staying. He said, "You're not leaving with me." I told him no. He then slapped me across the face in a room full of my friends and no one saw it. I was shocked. He leaned in an inch from my face and said, "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue." He turned around and walked out. He then continued to leave me harassing messages, calling me names and stalk me for the next 3 months. He'd show up at places he knew I would be. He would call me from other numbers and cry and ask me to go to counseling with him. He finally stopped. It ruined online dating for me forever. Didn't happen to me but a good friend of mine when I was living in Oregon around few years ago. He had an older sister who met some random guy from the East Coast online and were constantly chatting. After some time they developed feelings for each other and he decides to move cross country in order to marry her. The issue was she was 26, didn't have a job and was still living in her parents' house. He was incredibly lazy, a slob, never graduated high school and also couldn't keep a job to save his own life. But since she is lonely and insecure she accepts and continue living in their parents' house to this day. I never actually met the guy, but spoke to him on the phone. We'd met on MySpace when I was in college and exchanged email addresses when we realized we lived in the same town. Eventually, I gave him my phone number and made plans for him to call me. When he did, his voice creeped me out. It was how I imagined a serial killer would sound. By the time I got past it and was comfortable talking to him on the phone, I started noticing other red flags. Whenever I brought the neighborhood up, he changed the subject. At one point, I asked him what his favorite restaurant on the boulevard was and he hedged. So I made up a restaurant that I said was my favorite. He immediately said that was his favorite too and that he especially loved one of their dishes. He went on and on about this wonderful place that didn't exist, and there wasn't a similar one in town. So he couldn't be confused. I called him out on the fact that he'd obviously never been to my neighborhood. Turned out, he didn't even live in the same state as me. I was probably the horror of the story. Posted this before and, for what it's worth, I'm not proud of what I did. Met a girl my age in a chat room when I was 16. We talk every day and things got serious in a puppy love kind of way. I'd only ever seen one's picture of her, which was in black and white, but when she floated the idea of me coming to spend the week with her whilst her parents were away, I booked a ticket and traveled several hours on the train to go see her. She was waiting for me when the taxi pulled up and my heart sank. She looked a lot heavier than her picture suggested and I wasn't attracted to her at all. To top it off, the house I had to spend the next week smelled like dog. For some reason we put Lethal Weapon 4 on for us to watch and it was during the film that I decided I'd probably made a mistake and had to leave as soon as I could. The next day probably would have been too soon. So I decided in on the day after next. The part I'm least proud of is sneaking into her room before my taxi arrived and erasing my number in her phone. Then, on realizing that the majority of messages in her phone were from me and that she'd still have number, I snuck back into her room and deleted all those messages. The taxi came and I went home and never spoke nor heard from her again. Not a nice thing to do at all. I'm sorry, Emily. You deserved so much better. This was about 16 years ago. I, 26F, was talking to a guy online and we were calling each other back and forth. He lived in NJ and I lived in Mass. We finally decided to meet, so he drove up here from New Jersey. My friend was working at a laundromat at the time, so I decided it was a safe place for us to meet there. After hours of waiting, he pulled into the parking lot in an old beat-up car with all his belongings in the backseat, and he looked about 50 years old. He was pretty scary and I was pretty freaked out. I guess he thought he was moving in, which was no way happening as I had a roommate. What he told me on the phone, he was a few years older than me and I never saw a picture. I guess I was very trusting because everything he told me, I believed. Good thing I decided to meet him last minute in a public place. I had to tell him that I was not interested and he needed to leave that night. That was such a bad situation. Oh. Okay. When I was 14, I applied for jobs around my local area online. Most places didn't get back to me because I was a child. Except for one man who ran a printing shop who wanted to talk to me on MSN. I was eager for the job, so I began chatting to him. He was late 50s and seemed friendly. After a week or so of talking, he wanted to interview me in person. I jumped at the chance. The day of the interview, I dressed painstakingly neat and smart. He led me around the back of the shop and upstairs to a small room. I already had major misgivings at this point but was too afraid to back out. He locked us both in that room together and turned a camera on to face me. I don't remember much of what was said, but he forced himself onto me and then came all over my smart clothes. I was in shock and really shut down. But I remember the bizarre thought of how he'd ruined my clothes. So yeah. There's a vile video of me out there as a teenager being abused by an old man, and I never reported it because my mother beat the shit out of me for messing up my clothes. When I was younger, I met an online friend in a public place for the first time. He was about my age and hadn't lied about that. So I guess I'll let my guard down. Anyway, after we walked for a while, I noticed he had led me down a dark alley with no other people. He then looked at me and said how he really wanted to pay me right then and there. Right after he'd said that, my instinct kicked in, and I ran as fast as I've ever run in my life. Until I came to the train station. Here I jumped on the first train I saw and got the hell away from him. I matched with a girl on Tinder and we agreed to meet up at a nearby coffee shop. When I arrived, I was sitting in the parking lot and noticed only two people in the coffee shop. Some old guy and a girl who looked similar to the girl I matched with on Tinder. She didn't entirely look like the girl I matched with on Tinder, but she looked enough like her for me to pass it off as her using filters to make herself look better. I texted her that I'm here. When I did that, the old guy and the girl got their phones out at the same time and I got a text that said, "I'm inside." I went inside and went up to the girl and said, "Hey, Melissa, right?" She looked up from her phone, frowned up and said, No. Wrong person." Right after she said that, the old guy tapped me on the shoulder. I turned, he gave me a toothy smile and casually said, "Howdy." I ran out like I was running from a killer. Met a girl online once. Can't remember where, but this was 15-20 years ago. We chatted for a while and seemed to hit it off. Eventually she invited me to her house. Turns out she was having a party with about 30 people. She pretty much ignored the whole time I was there. Hung out with some cool people and played some Mario Kart. Left when everyone else started to. Never spoke to her again. I have a lot of online communities I'm involved in. Between some forums I'm active in and FFXI. I wasn't there for it, but a bunch of my FFXI friends got together one weekend 10-15 years ago. One of them got drunk off his ass, trashed some stuff, and made everyone else miserable. He never got invited again. The most prominent one was where I got seek blocked by 9/11. I had a trip cross country lined up for a car show and meet up with a bunch of people from a forum I was on. I had been talking to a girl out there for months beforehand and it had gotten pretty hot and heavy. So I planned to go out for the show, then hang out with her for a week or so after. I also had some work to do out there, but it was mostly to hang out with her. 9/11 happened the Tuesday before the trip. I ended up on one of the first flights out of town that Thursday. 90% of the group cancelled their trips though. When I landed, she sent someone else to pick me up and she was nowhere to be found. I saw her at the show for about 5 minutes, but besides that she ghosted me. I heard from her after a few days. Her ex and I had gotten back together after 9/11 happened because life is short, let's try it again, etc. I spent most of the trip in my hotel room watching the first X-Men movie on HBO. It was a surreal experience all around. They're not all horror stories though. Through the same group I made friends with another girl out of state. We hung out a few times but figured out we click better as friends. I met her best friend on one of my trips and we started talking online constantly. She flew down one weekend to see how we'd get along in person. I've been married 14 years just about, so I guess it worked out.